Okay, stunning. I'm going to start again. Hi, everyone. Hello, people watching this now, and hello, people watching this in the future. My name is Shanique. My pronouns are she, her, and I am with Backhow Consulting. Today's session is the fundamentals of anti-oppression. Our session today will be about 2 hours in length with a break at the in-between. Before we hop into today's content, I let you know what you can all expect. I want to acknowledge where this work takes place. Vancouver is situated on the stolen ancestral occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people. You may have heard this before or some version of this before, recognizing that your territorial acknowledgement will look different depending where you are physically in the world right now. I think it's especially important to ruminate on the fact that there is an inherent oppressive power dynamic at play between settlers and Indigenous people on these lands. So when we, talk about this work, equity work, inclusion work, it's important to recognize that this work is often championed and led by Indigenous folks in our region and in the lands known as Canada. Uh, I took a really great workshop by someone named Michelle Mahoney, who runs Decolonize First. I can share the link in the chat later, or share those resources when I share the slides with you. And she was talking about land acknowledgements, and she said something that really resonated with me. The example she gave was, say that I say that I acknowledge that your name's Shanique. Like that doesn't sound that great. Like I acknowledge, yeah, I acknowledge that your name's Shanique. What if instead I, recognized that and I celebrated that? And sort of the takeaway there being asking ourselves and reflecting what it looks like to not just acknowledge something, but to fully recognize and celebrate that. What does it look like to not just acknowledge that we're on this territory, these stolen territories, but to really celebrate that and to recognize that. What does it look like? What does that look like for you? So I want to, offer that prompt that I found really impactful for you all today to just sort of think about what it looks like to move into that space of, really celebrating the territory we're on, celebrating the folks who've been taking care of the land that we're on for over 1,000 years. If you don't know whose territory you're on, there's this great resource that I love to use. It is called native-land.ca. I just put it in the chat for you. I think it's really important to also remember that Indigenous communities don't exist as a monolith, and again, that your territorial acknowledgement changes depending on where you are in the world, in Canada, in BC. Nativeland.ca is a resource that I like to use when I'm traveling as well, remembering again that relationship to land. How can we, recognize that and celebrate that? If you are on a different territory than me, if you are on lands that are not the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam, and you'd like to share that in the chat today, I would love that. I welcome that. And if you're not sure, there's that really great resource. So if anyone would like to share in the chat whose territory they're on today, that would be fantastic. So with any sort of, big conversation, it's important that we set out ground rules so that we are all on the same page. So I'm just going to go through and set out some goals, some guidelines for our session today. The first one is attention to detail. So the work that we're about to hop into can be very complex. What our aim is today is to create a lens that will support you in perceiving detail so that we can think critically and act in turn. So what this means is that, we're acknowledging that oppression can be embedded in the institutions and structures we interact with, and that can be very overt, really obvious things, and it can also be very implicit things that are less obvious. The goal of this workshop today is to provide you with a lens to understand these details and interpret them in such a way that you can become an agent of change. So in the understanding that, these oppressive structures exist all around us, we can hopefully with this session support you in gaining a lens to notice and pick up on those little details within sort of your league and interacting with one another, as well as just sort of outside broadly in your day-to-day lives. Next is an acceptance and expectation of non-closure. We will not cover everything today, nor in our broader programming. At Backhow, we offer over, I think, 8 different workshops, and we won't cover everything even if you were to take every single one of these workshops. It's okay to feel unresolved and leave with further questions. I think in an ideal world, you could come to a 2-hour workshop and be like, fantastic, Shanique answered all of my questions. I'm leaving this with nothing like left to learn or left to unpack, and that is awesome. I'm going to tie a little bow on that and I'm going to go. And I'm here to tell you that that will not happen. Yeah, unfortunate news. You won't leave today with that perfect feeling of closure, and that is totally okay. This type of work doesn't have a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's ongoing work. It's the work that we want to continue doing throughout our lifetimes. I'll be speaking largely from my lived experience today, which will likely be very different from your experience today. I want to your lived experience. I'm here to answer any questions that come up throughout. If you want to ask those in the chat or raise your hand on Zoom, I can support with that. And also that reminding us today that I don't claim to have all the answers. We won't get to everything, but that shouldn't stop you from leaving this session and continuing to have these conversations, to reflect on these further questions, whether that be with your teammates or your family or your coworkers, and continuing on knowing that those unresolved questions are absolutely part of this work. The right to pass. So this work is done best when folks are tuned into their bodies. Listen to your cues, take breaks when needed, and pass if it's what's going to help you achieve the most depth. This session, there are parts of it where I'll ask questions to the group. I'll ask you to engage. I won't call on anyone. You have the right to pass. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot. I want you to do what feels good for you today. I think the session is more engaging when we can interact with one another, but I also recognize that it's 6:43 on a Monday, and that it's fair and valid for us to be tired. We've spent a lot of time on Zoom lately over the last 2.5 years, so I totally get wanting to hang out on your couch with your screen off. It's great seeing some of your faces on Zoom, but again, no pressure at all. If you need to eat dinner throughout or get a glass of water, please feel free to do so. Don't worry about offending me. You won't. And what else did I want to tell you? Oh yeah, you can ask questions throughout. That I'll give you a break. So feel free to take breaks as needed, but I'll also give you a break at the halfway mark, which would be 7:30. Challenging concepts and not people. Oops. Challenging concepts, not people. So today our workshop's emphasis is on systems and in turn embodiments of oppression. We want to name them so that we can locate them everywhere. So what this means is that in our session today, we'll be focusing on sort of these, larger concepts of violence instead of individual people. We want to explicitly name violence so that we can locate it wherever it is and work to undermine it. So today I'll be challenging concepts and not people. However, sometimes it is totally necessary to challenge people. For instance, if someone's being willfully ignorant or oppressive, things can become personal, and it's not my intention to diminish that at all. There are times where it is crucial to challenge people. However, in today's session, we are focusing on these larger systems. So our journey today has 5 distinct steps. We're going to start with what is it? What are some key perspectives? What are the impacts? How do we reprogram? And what can we do? So starting with the what is it? So before we get into what is anti-oppression, we'll sort of look at what is oppression. Oppression is a state of being in which some benefit and others do not. It is an umbrella term that encompasses all different experiences of uneven power dynamics. Those who do not benefit from the systems in place experience many repercussions that range from extremely subtle to extremely explicit, and all of which are connected to these broader systems of oppression. So we can think of oppression as sort of this umbrella term that speaks to this dynamic in which some folks benefit and others do not. So some folks will experience benefits from these systems in place, and many folks won't experience benefits from these, and that this oppression can look like, again, really obvious, overt things and also more subtle things. So then anti-oppression is a lens and practice of noticing, naming, and dismantling oppression. It's an umbrella term that encompasses all expressions of oppression, pointing to the fact that they are all connected and work to reinforce one another. Anti-oppression is both expansive and specific and everything in between. Due to the overwhelming omnipotence of oppression, we're about to work through it with a fine-tooth comb. So anti-oppression work is the work of noticing and working to dismantle these systems of oppression, this intentional practice of unpacking what these systems of oppression can look like and actively working to dismantle them. We're going to start talking about some key perspectives, and we're going to start with a little activity here. I'm going to give a content warning for this next activity for death and violence. So if you want to take a break for the next 5 minutes, if you want to put me on mute, if you want to go do something else, again, priority today being to take care of yourself. So there's a content warning that there'll be a mention of death and violence in the next exercise. So please do what you need to do today to take care of yourselves. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read out a list of names, and I just want you to note how many of these names you recognize. George Floyd, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, Alton Sterling, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile. I'm going to ask you in the chat. You can also message me privately if you'd prefer. You can do that just by clicking where it says to and just clicking my name, Shanique, and messaging me privately if you'd rather do that. Just a number between 0 and 7 of how many of these names you recognize. So from 0 to 7, how many of these names do we recognize today? Give you a second to write those numbers there. We have some 7s, 6, 5. Give you just a few more seconds here to put that number in the chat. We're just taking note of how many of these names we recognize today. Thank you for doing that. All right, so we have numbers ranging from 2 to 7 with a lot of, 7s, 6s, 5s. I'd say we probably have an average number of about, I'm going to do some quick mental math here. I'd say we have an average number of probably about 5.5. Does anyone have any ideas what might this group of names have in common? Any idea? What might this group of names, what might they share? What might they have in common with one another? You can feel free to write in the chat or unmute yourselves, whichever you're more comfortable with. What might this group of names have in common with one another? Yeah, police brutality. Yeah, Black folks killed by police, violence. Yeah, thank you everyone for, yeah, all American Black men and young people killed by police violence. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for engaging in the chat. I appreciate that. Yeah, so as that has been noted in the chat, we have a list here on the list of Black men and boys who've lost their lives to police violence. I specify men and boys because it's important to acknowledge that some folks on this list were as young as 12 years old. There's a process called adultification that happens where often racialized children are viewed as being a lot older than they are, not given sort of the same innocence attached to their youth and to their childhood, and they're often viewed as being a lot older than they are. So it's important to note that this is a list of both Black men and boys. So again, I'm going to read out a list of names, and same thing, I'd like you to just keep note of how many of these names you recognize. Breonna Taylor, Jazeline Ware, Michelle Cusso, Rakia Boyd, Shanique Proctor, Tanisha Anderson, Maya Hall. So again, I'm going to ask you in the chat, please feel free to do so privately to me directly or just in the chat on a 0 to 7. How many of these names do we recognize? Give you another few seconds to do that in the chat there, just sharing from 0 to 7, how many of these names do we recognize? Thanks, folks, for doing that. Okay, so this time we have numbers ranging from 1, and I believe we have the highest number of 1, 5, probably with an average number of about 1 or 2. So previously we had numbers ranging from, I believe, we had an average number around 5.5, and now we have about 1 to 2 as being the average number. Does anyone have any idea what might this group of names have in common? What might this group of names share with one another? Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, same, but violence against women. Yeah, so on this list here, we have a list of Black women and girls, and this list also is inclusive of trans women who have lost their lives to police violence. So, yeah, just give that a moment to settle in your body. The reality of this activity can be a really visceral experience. So, again, if you need a moment, please, I encourage you to take it. This is taken from a lesson from someone named Kimberly Crenshaw. We'll talk about Kimberly Crenshaw more in just a moment. But essentially, what we're seeing here is intersectionality in practice, and we'll unpack this word intersectionality more as well. But existing, sometimes existing at multiple intersections, particularly when they are increasingly oppressed by societal power structures. So, meaning that you exist at the intersection of not just being Black, but also being Black and a woman, being Black and a trans woman. When folks exist at multiple intersections, when these intersections are increasingly oppressed, this means not only is your life more precarious, but you might not even have your life mourned in the same way. So when we think about whose names, make major news headlines, whose names we hear spoken about, whose names turn into these larger movements, we can consider, that not knowing of the tragedy, not knowing the names of these women, it makes it more difficult for us to understand the pervasiveness of the violence, and also not knowing the tragedy strips folks of the ability to grieve. So Kimberly Crenshaw spoke to this exactly when she coined the term intersectionality. So intersectionality is a concept that describes how patterns of subordination can overlap or intersect. So people's lives are often informed by multiple identities that need to be considered. Systems of oppression are all interconnected, and we must examine them as such. Kimberly Crenshaw did a very similar exercise to the one that we just did here. And no matter sort of where she was throughout North America, the results were very, very similar. That folks noticed or recognized more of the names on the left and on the right. So Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar. She coined this term, intersectionality, in 1989 as a result of her legal scholarship. Many of her clients were Black women, and in a particular case, she was advocating for a group of Black women who had been let go from their jobs, unfairly let go from their jobs. And sort of the counter argument was nothing unfair had happened because Black people still worked at the job and women still worked at the job. So the sort of counter argument was that these Black women had not been treated unfairly because, Black people still worked at the job and women still worked at the job. So Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term intersectionality to describe how these categories overlap with one another. It wasn't enough to think of sort of Blackness and womanhood as two separate things. Many people, they existed, they were overlapping things. They existed as both at the same time. So intersectionality is this term that describes how these different intersecting sort of categories overlap with one another. So just to sort of visualize that, if we're thinking intersectionality, we can view it initially as two circles. So if we think on the left here, focusing on sort of female issues and intersections, we can think of women's rights to vote, access to the job market, women's rights to own property, and women's equity initiatives. We think on the right as it pertains to race, we can think of Black people's rights to vote, access to the job market, Black folks' rights to own property, affirmative action, and equal employment. So as a result, we can view intersectionality as the space where these categorically intersect, providing another dimension to view things. So, when we think about, the year that women had the right to vote, it was specifically white women who had the right to vote. Or if we think about Black folks' rights to own property, it was specifically initially Black men who had the right to own property. So intersectionality is this space in which these categories overlap with one another in order to complicate and things and provide necessary dimension. So we can sort of think of intersectionality as this space in between where these different categories overlap. So throughout history, Kimberly Crenshaw's theory built on the work of the Combahee River Collective, a group of Black feminists in the 1970s who described how different forms of discrimination were interlocking. So things like racism, classism, and sexism, they weren't only related, but they all reinforced one another. As early as 1924, published scholarship by Zik Kalasa, a Sioux activist, examined how gender, race, and age shaped women's experiences and how colonial forces used gender, race, and age to control women's bodies and land. Even further back, abolitionist and women's rights activist Sojourner Truth made her famous Ain't I a Woman speech in 1851. So if you haven't heard of this speech before, you can look it up. Sojourner Truth, Ain't I a Woman? So she wrote this speech in 1851, long before 1989, when Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term intersectionality. And in this speech, Sojourner Truth speaks, she's saying, you say that women should have doors held open for them, that women shouldn't work all day, that women should be helped across the street. But no one has ever held a door open for me. I work day in and day out, and no one's ever helped me across the street. Ain't I a woman? So, Sojourner Truth was, questioning this idea of when we say woman, who do we mean and who's left out of that idea, recognizing that women sort of across the evenly across the world aren't all treated equally with the same rights. So, intersectionality throughout history. Why we talk about the history of intersectionality is because it's important for us to pay homage to the folks who provided us with this tool that we're lucky enough to be using today. Intersectionality is not a buzzword, but rather a call to action. It's a lens and a responsibility. It's ethical for us to learn it and relearn it and learn it again and continue to unpack how intersectionality prompts us to perceive the world. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to read out some questions. And I'd like you to just think about these questions as I go through them. Think about your own individual experience, if you've experienced these things, if you're able to do these things. We can just go through and reflect on that. Have you ever been called a racial slur? Are people who look like you stereotyped to be dangerous or unprofessional? Does your gender match the assigned one on your birth certificate? How often do you get asked if you want children? How long can you remain in Canada? Do you have a passport? Can you hold your partner's hand in public and feel no fear of judgment? Have you seen many intimate scenes that represent your sexual orientation in movies? Have you ever worried if there will be an elevator at an event? Did mainstream schooling suit your learning style? When you mention your religion, do questions about your political views quickly follow? Have you felt nervous or ashamed to ask for time off work for a religious event? Did you go to university? Have you ever worried about where your next meal is coming from? Have you always felt like your dreams were achievable? So, yeah, I want us to just, as we're reflecting, the reason we go through and ask these questions is because while we might think we know the privilege of our identity when we say these broad categories like gender, race, and class, doing this work helps to remind ourselves of the everyday implications of our identity and helps us to tap into what our privilege really provides us with. So, like the exercise we just did with the names at the beginning, these questions aren't hypothetical. They're not objective. They're reality, and we need to make sure these power dynamics are intimately known by us so we can call upon them all the time. So I know that when I'm, going through these questions or reflecting on them myself, it can be, powerful to just consider the ways in which we might have privilege in some areas or a lack of privilege in other areas. I know specifically as we're queer in this space, I can think about the what it's like to hold my partner's hand in public and to feel judgment for that. And I can recognize that there's a lack of privilege that I exist with there. And I can also recognize that there's privilege in having a passport and not having to worry about how long I can remain in the country, to privilege in being able to go to university. So I think what's important about sort of doing this inventory of our privileges isn't sort of to inherently then, I don't think that privilege inherently in and of itself is something that is harmful or is a bad thing or is something that we need to be ashamed of, but instead for us to be able to do that inventory to recognize, okay, where might I have blank spots? In what areas might I need to spend a little bit more time listening instead of speaking? How can I sort of view the world with sort of a more more of a wide open view, recognizing that there are things that someone else may be more of an expert in, or their experiences that I might not be able to relate to, which sort of relates to our next slide here. When we think about sort of privilege, we can imagine it almost as us being in sort of this circle. We're all in this circle together, and we can like look to our left and look to our right. We can see what's going on, but we're not necessarily like spinning our heads all the way around like owls and seeing what's going on around behind us. We're kind of just looking at what's going on in our sort of vision. We can think about folks who are marginalized, and I use that word as in folks who are pushed to the margins by these societal power structures. Folks who are marginalized can then, look to the left and look to the right, but also they have a really good view of what's going on in the center of that circle. So when we think about things like ideal beauty standards or ideal pictures of success, if you are someone who is marginalized, not only can you have a really clear vision of what it's like sort of in that privilege, but you can also look to your left and your right and have a very good view that you and people who exist around you do not fit that ideal. Whereas if you're someone who exists with more privilege, sort of one of the innate sort of impacts of having that privilege is that we're less likely to sort of see with outside of that circle. We're sort of just looking at what's around us. Bell Hooks speaks to choosing the margins as a space of radical openness. This idea that when we can actively choose the margins, choose to take that step back, to listen and to amplify folks whose experience exists outside of our own, we can access a more radical sense of openness in sort of taking that time to reflect on experiences and that exist outside of our own. So next we are going to talk about some of the effects of these systems of oppression, and I'm going to turn it to you all in the chat for some engagement on this one. So what we're going to do next is we're going to name some of these systems of oppression. So when we can build a self and organizational awareness of historical marginalizations and ongoing inequality, both locally and globally, it better allows us to understand each individual's experiences and barriers. So when we can intentionally build an understanding of what these systems of oppression look like, what they mean, when we can name them explicitly, it helps us to better understand, okay, so what role do I play in this? What's happening around me? How do I work to remedy this? So naming can help us establish common understandings of these pervasive systems. Because we all live within them, it's important to unpack them and unpack the ways we are all impacted by them. If you've ever heard of like name it to tame it, that feeling when you're like, okay, I'm feeling anxious. And when I can name that feeling, it sort of immediately makes it feel a bit better. You're like, okay, I can name this. I can better understand what's happening when I put a name to it. We want to do the same thing with these systems of oppression. So we're going to start by naming some of these systems of oppression. So these look like things like sort of your isms or your like phobias, not like actual phobias, but like homophobia, for example. So we want to name these systems of oppression, and we can just do that in the chat together. So yeah, things like racism or homophobia. We want to start by just naming some of these systems of oppression. You just put them in the chat. Yeah, sexism. Thanks for starting us off, Kelly. Fat phobia, transphobia, ableism. Absolutely. Yeah, ageism. Absolutely. Classism, colonialism. Yeah, great work. Any other ones we can think of? Yeah, neoliberalism, xenophobia. Yeah, absolutely. Biphobia, totally. Yeah, heteronormativity, absolutely. Yeah, we can think of things like colorism. So, discrimination based on the color or the darkness of someone's skin. We can think of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Yeah. Did we say, yeah, capitalism? Totally. Yeah, I think we've named a lot of them here. So what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about what some of their effects look like. So I'm going to pick two of them from the chat here. I'm going to pick, what am I going to pick? I'm going to pick, okay, so I'm going to send you a Google Drive link in 1 second here. You're going to get that in the chat and let me know if you have any issues accessing it. Okay, so I'm sending you a link in the chat here. Let me know if you have any issues opening it up, and it's going to take you to Google Drive. I'll share my screen so you can look at it too on mine. Okay, great. And you all are logging in as little anonymous animals here. Stunning. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're going to spend some time talking about what are the impacts of these systems of oppression. So starting on the left here under ableism, we're going to spend a couple minutes writing down what we think the impacts, the effects of ableism is. So ableism is the discrimination of folks based on their disabilities. So these can look like physical disabilities. We can also think of things like mental illnesses can fall into that category as well. So ableism is the discrimination towards those who are living with a disability. So we're gonna spend a couple minutes here. We're just thinking, we're building an inventory. What might the impacts and the effects of ableism might look like? What might those things look like? And you can just say, let me know if you're having any issues accessing that Google Drive. We're just gonna spend a couple minutes here. Yeah, we can jump back and forth. I was going to give you a few minutes to work on ableism and then go to racism, but feel free to just go back and forth. So we'll spend a little bit of time writing down some of the impacts and the effects of both ableism. And when you're done with that, you can go over to the next side, and we're going to do the same thing with racism. So we're writing down the effects, the impacts. What does racism look like? What does ableism look like? How might that impact people? How might that impact folks? Give you a couple more minutes there. Okay, if you've been working mostly on one side, feel free to go to the other side. All right. Yeah, so how might folks experiencing ableism or racism be impacted or affected? Okay, one more minute. Okay, I'm just moving these over to our other board. Okay. Okay, trying to fit as many of them as I can here. We came up with lots. Okay, so I'm going to go through and read some of these. So, impacts and effects of ableism. How might ableism impact people? So, in a limit of sick days, not being hired because of disability, employers not willing to make accommodations, language that discriminates against mental illness, lack of healthcare research in areas that don't involve cis men. Yeah, stigma to those with mental illness, inability to get insurance, lack of recognition of the importance of mental health, no ramp or entrance at entrances, only stairs. Yeah, housing without aids, structures in place, limited transit or vehicle access, social isolation and exclusion, inaccessible bathrooms, teaching to one learning style, no closed captioning, no braille, access, cost of physical therapy equipment, no elevators, broken elevators, unnecessary two-step climbs, poor disability pay, ramp access only on the back door, otherwise, sorry, got cut off. Centering white experience, and now we're on to racism, looking at the impacts of racism. So, centering of white experiences, lack of access to make up projects, minimal range, not hearing underrepresented voices, what professionalism looks like, perfectionism, defensiveness, white tears, white savior complex, profiling, singular limited worldviews presented in media, physical violence and assault, overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, underrepresentation of BIPOC in film and TV, police violence, targeting of Black and Indigenous people of color, lack of clean water in Indigenous communities, even ones right next to cities like Metro Vancouver, absolutely. Lack of attention to issues like the opioid crisis until it starts affecting white folks. Yeah, ongoing importance of the opioid crisis, totally. Biases in professional environments. So you might have written one that just didn't fit over on this board. And so feel free to reference that as we do what we're about to do next. So what we're doing next here is we're looking at sort of what we've come up with, the impacts of ableism and the impacts of racism, and seeing if we see any overlap. So, for example, I can start us off here by saying that one overlap of both racism and ableism. So this example here is a lack of access to makeup products, but I think we could say a lack of access in general is an impact of both racism and ableism. So that there's a lack of access for folks, not being hired, for example, a lack of access to opportunities, and a lack of access because of racism. One overlapping impact of racism and ableism is a lack of access. So I'm going to just draw a little line here between lack of access as it connects to both ableism and racism. So do we see anything else? Anything else here that might be an overlap? Any sort of overlapping impacts? They don't need to be exactly word for word. And feel free to just yell those out on Zoom or type them in the chat. Do we see anything on these lists? Again, it can also be something that maybe you wrote that just didn't make its way over here. Do we see any overlap? Any things that are both an impact, an effect of ableism and racism? Yeah, underrepresentation of people in film and media. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thanks for starting us off there, Jay. Oh, underrepresentation of people in media. Yeah, we had that as an impact of racism and also ableism that we see underrepresentation. Absolutely. Yeah, underrepresented voices. Absolutely another one. Yeah, underrepresented voices. Yeah, and equity in professional environments. Totally. I think we had not being hired, uh, like pay inequities. Definitely an impact of both ableism and racism. Yeah, not paying attention to issues until they impact able-bodied white folks. Absolutely. We had written here not paying attention to issues, lack of issues until they impact white folks. We can say also an impact of ableism is that often things aren't paid attention to until they impact able-bodied folks. Yeah, a savior complex, absolutely an impact of both ableism and racism. Housing discrimination, totally. Yeah, sometimes it's hard for me to find where they were written, but also, yeah, you're all doing wonderful at this. Thank you. Yeah, a savior complex, not paying attention. Yeah, anything else we can see, any other overlaps we see here. I think an increase of physical violence is also an impact of both racism and ableism. That folks who live with disabilities often have a higher risk of violence as well. Yeah, lack of healthcare research, absolutely. Yeah, as a result of both ableism and racism. Yeah, totally. We can say we have at the bottom here biases in professional environments. Yeah, another one that kind of connects over here as well. Yeah, someone said savior complex. We'll connect that one as well. Yeah, even this idea of perfectionism, that being this idea of folks who are part of racialized communities, this idea that there's this perfection that they are meant to obtain. We could say the same thing. Folks with disability often expected to, behave in ways where they are sort of this perfect, existing at this level that capitalism access to exist on. Um, you know, Certain sort of biases around what perfectionism looks like can also be an overlap of both racism and ableism. Yes, so we've got a lot here, a lot of overlap, and we could honestly continue to go through and unpack these even more. This is just sort of picking two that we chose there, but we would have seen similar things if we chose any other two systems of oppression. We can see here that we have these similar impacts and effects of both ableism and racism. And this is exactly what Kimberly Crenshaw spoke about when she said that these systems of oppression don't only sort of exist connected to one another, but that they also reinforce one another, that these things reinforce each other. So we can think about what it means for someone to exist with an increased rate of violence or uh, a higher risk of or a more difficult time accessing employment as a result of not just their race, but also living with a disability. We can think then of how these things overlap with one another and how they reinforce one another, how these things are all connected. These oppressive institutions, their effects are often shared, and all these effects work in really similar ways in that they privilege some and subjugate others. Their effects are not isolated, but they're rather super interconnected. So it's important for us to think about that and consider the ways that the impacts of these system oppressions all look very similar. They have similar impacts on mental health, on physical health, and that folks who are experiencing both of these things will then, as a result, experience heightened effects or heightened impacts of these things, and that these systems of oppression all work in really similar ways, and that we would have found, if we chose, say, classism and homophobia or sexism and transphobia, choosing these different ones, they all have really similar effects and impacts. Some of the things that we wrote on the list can fall into our category of microaggressions. Microaggressions are subtle, insidious aggressions that are either intentional or unintentional, and they often reoccur. So microaggressions dismiss, isolate, belittle, and other individuals, particularly on the basis of marginalized identities. So microaggressions aren't called micro because they are not a big deal. They're called that because they happen on a more interactional level, like a smaller scale. Oftentimes, these are more day-to-day occurrences. With microaggressions, we can think of this analogy of death by a million paper cuts. If we get one paper cut, it's okay, it stings, but we're going to be all right. Two sort of sucks more, but it's manageable. But now imagine a million of these paper cuts, hundreds, thousands of these paper cuts, and how quickly that's going to become completely unmanageable and impact our overall quality of life. So we can think about this idea that these things might seem sort of like small in the sort of smaller scheme of things, but if we zoom out and recognize that these microaggressions are often repeated and the impact that they have a large impact. So what I'm going to do is we're sort of looking at this iceberg model here. Yeah, that we're looking at this iceberg. Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, Absolutely. Sending love to everyone in this moment, and also a reminder to take care of yourselves as needed. If you need to take a break, we're almost at our halfway point break in just about, yeah, like 5-10 minutes here. Yeah, thanks so much for participating so far. Really appreciating all the engagement in the chat and in the last exercise as well. So with microaggressions, we can think of sort of this iceberg model. At the top, we can think of things that we, for the most part, societally think as being in the mainstream as being bad without question. We can think of things like sexual advances, physical violence, rude gestures or comments, verbal threats, slurs. These are things that, largely in the mainstream we see as not being okay or as being unacceptable. And often when we think about the sort of you know oppression that's happening day to day, a large aspect of it are these things that happen underneath this iceberg, this like large aspect of things that might not necessarily be viewed as in the mainstream as not being okay, or as things we don't necessarily have zero tolerance policies for, but that still contribute to upholding these systems of oppression and harm. So as we get to the waterline here, we have touching without consent and jokes about identity. So for example, in touching without consent, we can think of, if I'm in the grocery store and a man walks by and touches my lower back, I might think, okay, he was just touching me to try to get through in the aisle. But I can also think, using this lens of anti oppression, would he have touched my lower back to get by if I wasn't a woman? Most likely not. What does it mean that someone feels entitled to touching my body without getting consent because of my gender? Similar with this idea of jokes about identity, folks might want to laugh something off as not being a big deal, just being a joke. But again, thinking about that paper cut analogy, what does it mean for someone to repeatedly experience jokes or comments that are belittling, that remind you that folks don't see your experience as being valid, and that these things add up and they have an impact. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to go through and read out some of these microaggressions that we have listed on the iceberg. Again, not a complete and total list. I'm sure we could come up with a lot more together. But as I go through this list, I want you to just sort of think, like, if there are any where you're like, I don't know what that word means, or why is that a microaggression, or I don't quite understand. We're going to have time to circle back and unpack these together if there's any that we're not sure about. So I'm going to just go through and read this here. Oh, okay. So lack of promotion or leadership opportunity, saying that's savage, touching someone's hair, flirting, gaslighting, dead naming, misuse of pronouns, asking someone where are you really from, tone policing, questions about relationship or sex, telling someone they're in the wrong bathroom, tokenism, misuse of social media, stereotyping, saying all lives matter. And we have, am I missing one? Oh, cultural appropriation. So yeah, going through, reading these kind of off the top, are there any here, and feel free to message me privately again too, are there any that we're not really sure about? Any that we're kind of not clear, how's that a microaggression, or want some explanation on, please feel free to let me know.
What do you mean by misuse of social media?
Yeah, good question. So misuse of social media can look like a bunch of different things. If we think about the way that social media is such a large portion of many of our lives and day to day, can be misused in a bunch of different ways that sort of pertain to microaggressions. But I'm going to give I can give a couple examples. So one way that social media can be misused is if we think of, yeah, kind of different examples in different directions. One way that we can think of is if we think of June 2020, after George Floyd's death. And again, this is a perfect example of challenging the concept, not the person. So if anyone did this, no judgment at all. But in June 2020, after George Floyd's death, we saw, many folks were sharing a black square with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And how hashtags work is sort of like a hashtag is like a resource hub. So if you were to click hashtag queer softball, you could click on that hashtag and you could find a bunch of different sort of resources or where teams were situated or different people playing, or you could click hashtag vegan baked goods and you could find a bunch of different recipes. The Black Lives Matter hashtag worked the same way. There was a lot of really important information there. It was a resource hub that had been building for a really long time. And what happened when folks posted a black square with that hashtag is that it completely erased this resource hub that had been building for a very long time. So people who depended on this to find information, where to donate, where people were needed to meet on the front lines. In just a matter of minutes, this resource hub was completely erased. So that is one example of how social media can be misused. Another way that social media is often misused is if we think about the sharing of content that might be triggering to folks, that is often triggering to folks, that's shared without a content warning. So oftentimes we see images of, images or triggering, violent images or triggering headlines that are shared without content warnings on social media. That's another example of how social media can be misused. You can think about sort of, again, going back to that paper cut analogy, the impact of being online and repeatedly seeing images of people who look like you or have similar experiences to you, experiencing violence and harm, and these images being shared in a way that might be sort of disconnected from the real impact that it has on folks in those communities, to see those images without being able to opt out or being given that content warning. Um, Another example of how social media can be misused is when we think about what's another one that I was going to recognize here, tokenism. So that social media can also be used in a way that can be tokenizing for folks. So tokenism, I like to think of tokenism as that representation without relationship. So when we have one person from a marginalized community that sort of represents, this idea of maybe someone checking a box, or we posted a trans model on our Instagram page. So now our company is inclusive. Whereas when we have that representation without that relationship, without that care in that relationship, we're often, creating more harm. So it's not enough to just sort of have one person from that group, represented online or in that space, if that space isn't actually somewhere that is safe for someone in that community to access. So that is another way that social media can be misused, and also kind of relates to another one on this list, which is tokenism. So we can think of if someone, hires me to their workforce because they're like, hey, we need a Black person in our workspace. But that workplace that I'm brought into is one that isn't safe for Black folks, where they aren't doing the work to unpack sort of how racism functions in that space. Then we've sort of fallen into the situation where folks are sort of checking this box without actually having that relationship of care and making sure that that is a safe space for folks within marginalized communities to be in. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I have some just private ones coming, and I'm just going to read these quickly. Hmm. Yeah. Yep. Okay. I'm saying yes, and people are like, I don't know what you're reading. Another one I'm going to just touch on is flirting. So I think that that is one that can be maybe difficult sometimes to uh, understand and unpack. And I think that similar to when I sort of touched on touching with consent, is that I think consent is super important. I think that there is a difference between sort of flirting that is consensual. I think about so many folks meet someone maybe that they end up in a relationship with in a workplace. However, not everyone, that doesn't mean that everyone's open to being flirted with in their workplace. I think it's also important to consider how power plays into these dynamics as well. If we're thinking about workplaces, for example, how flirting with someone in their workplace, especially if there's a power imbalance there, might make someone uncomfortable, but also in a position where they don't feel safe to voice that discomfort. I think that Flirting is one where if that flirting isn't consensual, if that isn't wanted, I think it's super important to, be reading people's body language, also reading the response from people, also remembering that not everyone shows up to, a workplace or a softball league wanting to be flirted with. Some people do, and I think that that is fine. Again, consent is so important, but I also think that it's important to remember as a default that not everyone is comfortable with that sort of exchange, and that often it's so important for us to consider how power plays into these things and how someone who feels uncomfortable might not feel safe voicing that they're uncomfortable. So to be taking that time to read body language, to ask ourselves if we feel like this is being reciprocated, and if it's not, to be honest with ourselves about that, and remember that we could be putting someone in an uncomfortable position. Yeah, important to consider that and to think about that one. Another one that I've been asked about as well, and I want to just sort of go into a little bit, is this idea of touching without consent. I think that some of us, I know some folks are just like, I'm a really touchy person, or I'm just someone who's really, when I feel close to someone, I touch them. And I think it's also so important, again, bringing it back to consent again and again, to remember that not everyone's comfortable having their body touched, even if this is something that is just sort of how you are, what you do. I think it's so important to just check in with someone, even if it's something as simple as like a congratulatory hug, because someone did great. Just to say, get into that practice of asking someone, is it okay if I hug you? Do you mind being touched there? Um, a lot of us, I want to sort of, I'm generalizing here, but a lot of us haven't been sort of weren't raised in cultures where we were allowed to assert our boundaries around touch and what felt good and what doesn't feel good. So I think it's really important to enact that, and to actively act that sort of change out by asking and getting that consent. And I feel like the more that we do it, the easier that it gets, and it becomes sort of just second nature. Again, even if your intentions aren't to make someone feel uncomfortable, we want to think about our impact versus the intention. We're going to go into that more after the break. But yeah, just to really come back to this idea of consent, we don't want to just assume someone is okay with touching, and also to remember that consent can change day to day. So just because someone is okay with being flirted with one day or being touched one day doesn't necessarily mean that they're okay with it again the next month or the next year. So remembering that consent is also ongoing is super important too. Okay, 7:35. Gonna give you a break. We're at the 1 hour mark. Let's take, how long should we take? I'm gonna give you 10 minutes. So it's 7:35 right now. Let's come back at 7:45. If there were any items on this microaggression iceberg that you had questions on, or words that you weren't familiar with, um, feel free to ask me during the break, and I can come back to that when we're back from break in 10 minutes. Okay, have a break, have a snack, have some water, go to the bathroom. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Okay, stunning. Okay, recording back on. So when we think about oppression, we want to think about it as something that isn't necessarily immediate. Like, we don't just wake up in these systems of oppression overnight. They start out slowly and they build over time. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that works. So we can think of, an individual experience that we have, sort of an individual experience, and how that individual experience, we add a belief to that individual experience, we can get to a stereotype. So I'm going to use an example of Charles Darwin. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Charles Darwin's flaws. So Charles Darwin, who's very, world renowned for his work on evolution. So Charles Darwin went to the global south, and he had this experience. He was in the global south for the first time, and from that experience, there was a belief that was attached to this experience. His belief was that people in the global south must all be the same. They must all sort of, he experienced a community of people that were different from him, and his belief was that people in the global south must all be this way, the same way as the community that he met. So when we have one simplified belief and we attach that to an entire group of people, that's when we get a stereotype. So we can think of a stereotype as this sort of simplified one belief. We have an experience, we attach a belief, and that's how we get to a stereotype. When we add a value to that belief, that's when we get to a prejudice. So Charles Darwin saw these people that spoke differently, dressed differently, they used different tools, they spoke different languages, and he attached a value to that. So not only were these people, all the same as one another in his view, there was also a value judgment that the way that they did things, was different, was backwards, was not the correct way of doing something. So when we attach that value judgment, that's when we get to a prejudice. And then when we add an action to that prejudice, that's when we get to discrimination. So you can think of discrimination as acting on those prejudice. So Charles Darwin wrote a book, a really popular book known as the book title is The Origin of Species. However, the original title of this book was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So the original title of this book, Origin of Species, was a title that included the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. This idea that there were favored races who deserved to live and to persevere in life, and those that did not. The title was shortened to Origin of Species, as it is known today. But essentially, yeah, Charles Darwin acted on this prejudice, and that acted, and then which led us to the discrimination of the things that he was writing about. So when people with power access that discrimination, that's when we get to these systems of oppression. So we can think of when that discrimination, when there's power enacted to it, that's when we get to these systems of oppression. When people with power, people who have systemic power, decision-making power, access these discriminatory beliefs, we get to these systems of oppression. I'm going to have a brief mention if you want a content warning here, if you want to just take a mute me, turn your volume down for the next couple of minutes. I'm going to briefly mention genocide and a brief mention of the Holocaust. So if you, again, taking care of ourselves today, feel free to just step away, put me on mute, log off, log back on, whatever you need to do. So when we think about sort of these ideas, when people in power can access these discriminatory ideas, we can think about things, these beliefs of certain people, of certain religious groups not deserving to live on. We can think about things even in Canada, where there was not that long ago the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. When we think about things like the Holocaust, these beliefs that certain people deserve to live on and the others do not. We can think about again how this discrimination, when we add power to it, that's when we get to these systems of oppression. And I'm not saying that Charles Darwin is solely responsible, for all these terrible things happening in the world, but I want to just sort of highlight sort of how we go up this staircase and how these things contribute, how when then folks in power can access, when they're accessing information, not an experience. So when people with power aren't experiencing the individual experience, they're experiencing learning about a community, a group of people already at this level of discrimination, how we get to these systems of oppression. And we can even sort of, another example here is this book written by someone named Edward Long, The History of Jamaica. And in this book, he wrote that Africans were inferior and not human, that Africa was backwards, that tyranny, war, and chaos were the natural conditions of the continent. This book ended up being a defense of slavery and a justification for colonialism. So folks were then accessing this information already at this step of discrimination. Folks, echoes of Long's most venomous passages can be heard in books written by men of later generations who did not venture to Africa. Their views of African societies they encountered were contaminated by Long and other racial theorists before their ships had even landed. So we can see then how sort of these systems of oppression, they can start as an individual experience and go up the staircase. So we could even do this with our own sort of, think of everyday sort of examples. You can think about you are walking in a certain area of town, you have an experience, and, maybe someone makes you feel unsafe. We can attach that belief then that everyone in this part of town must be unsafe. We have this value judgment here where these people, folks who live in this area cannot be trusted, are dangerous, people that look a certain way. We can think of this individual experience that we attach a belief to and a value to, and we wind up in this place of prejudice. So not only do we have this simplified view of an entire group, but we have a value judgment attached to that. Can think of then action when we act on that, when we then actively avoid people who look a certain way or who live in a certain area of town. And then when power gets involved, so when folks with decision making power, we can think of these systems of oppression that happen where we have, entire areas of town where they're food deserts. So meaning that they don't have access to clean, to healthy food or grocery stores. We can think of where schools are located, where folks where there are schools with better education systems located. We can think about then how this individual experience can go up this staircase to reach these systems of oppression that we think about. We can also look at sort of the difference between discrimination and also oppression, that the difference between discrimination and oppression is when there's that systemic power involved. When folks who have that systemic power can then, make that decision making, and that ultimately impacts people's lives. So just like we can go up this staircase, we want to envision what it looks like to come back down. If we can go up it, then how do we come back down? And you could sort of imprint or place in this staircase your own steps for coming down. I think that these are just some good examples as a starting place. So the first one being awareness. So we don't know what we don't know, which is why awareness is so important when we don't know about these things, when we don't have an inventory of what is going on in the world, what our privilege affords us with. It's really difficult to make change when we don't know what's going on. So awareness as that first step. And then allyship. So allyship can look like, recognizing that someone experiences a struggle that's different than yours, and allyship can say, okay, I want to stand with people who experience this. I want to support. I want to help. We can think of allyship as that. So now that we're aware of this, we want, us. The next step down might be to be an ally. So how can we support folks who are experiencing these systems of oppression? And next is equity. Going to talk about that in our next slide here. But equity in this context speaks to the redistribution of power and resources as they are needed. So recognizing, okay, if this is an issue right now, how can I bring attention to that instead of saying, okay, well, this, and this are all things we should be looking at. Equity might say, okay, right now what's important is for us to focus on this issue as it is coming up in this moment. We'll talk more about equity in the next slide. And then solidarity. I like to think of solidarity as a step up from allyship. So if allyship says, I believe that this is happening, I want to support you, solidarity then says, how can I use what power and privilege I have? How can I give up power and privilege to stand to support someone, to stand alongside them. So solidarity can look like using that power and privilege you have, giving up that power and privilege to really enact sort of those values of allyship. So instead of just saying, instead of simply saying, I believe you, solidarity can say, okay, so what can I do? So that could look like speaking up in a situation that might be uncomfortable to speak up in. Solidarity can look like showing up on the front lines. Solidarity, can look like recognizing that the onus of speaking up about something harmful might always fall on the person who experiences that harm. So how can we use our power and privilege to amplify their voices as someone else's voice, as opposed to, maybe sitting back. So that solidarity piece can be, can be uncomfortable, can bring up some discomfort at time as it sort of prompts us to reflect on how to give up some of that power privilege or use some of that power and privilege that we might live with. And then from there, we can, again, stepping down, imagine sort of how these steps can support us in getting down to that step of equality. So equity versus equality. You may have seen this image before, something like it. We have top left here, 3 people of 3 different heights watching a baseball game. They've all been given equal sized boxes to stand on to see over that fence. And as we can see in this image here, boxes aren't really doing what they're meant to be doing. They're not really succeeding in the goal. We have this person who is tall, who can see wonderfully over the fence with their box, and this person who is shorter, who can't see as clearly. So we can look at that there and sort of see that these boxes aren't supporting folks in the way that they might need to. And so then we can look at equity. Again, that's that redistribution of power and resources as they are needed. So recognizing that the person on the right is given two boxes. They needed two boxes to see over. The person in the middle needed one, and the person on the left could see fine over the fence to begin with. They might not need a box. So whereas equality might say, let's give everything to everyone equally, equity prompts us to think about how resources can be sort of shared on a needs-based level, recognizing that, yeah, what sort of equity calls for is recognizing that we aren't all starting on that equal playing field. And then we can look at the bottom left here at our reality, um, where the person who is the tallest is standing on 7 boxes, and the person who was the shortest is underground. Can anyone think of any examples in our everyday lives where we might see this reality? Where might we sort of see this reality enacted? Any examples we can think of?
Um, I'm kind of reminded with this baseball metaphor of what I've heard of, like someone who thinks like they hit a home run, but they were actually born on third base. I think that maybe when it comes to, say, starting a tech company, for example, people may feel self-made, but in fact, they were born into a ton of privilege, whereas other folks may not have even had access to the education or anything else.
Yes.
Um,
Totally. Thank you so much, Mallory. Great example. Also, loving the baseball metaphors. This is all really working full circle today. Totally. Yeah, that's such a great example of that idea of folks starting already on that third base, of having that head start. You already have those boxes piled up from you. Yeah, Nat, nepotism in the workplace. And Aaron said here, access to healthcare from rural communities. Exactly. Yeah, access to housing. These are all great examples, that it's easier to access healthcare if you already sort of have that privilege, if you, look a certain way or live in a certain area, when we're stacking those boxes on top of each other. Someone in a workshop gave this great example. Um, of overdraft fees. This idea that when you have no money in your bank account, you're charged a fee, and you go sort of further into zero, into the negatives there. But say you have a bunch of money in a tax-free savings account, you can then sort of accumulate more money on top of that money. This idea that when you have, that privilege to begin with, it's a lot easier to continue to stack those boxes on top of each other, versus someone who maybe isn't starting with that advantage, and it's harder to sort of get out of that. And then in our analogy here, we have liberation as this world without the fence. I think sometimes when we talk about privilege and power, and recognizing it and giving it up, there's this idea that can come up of, okay, so what am I supposed to do then? Give everything away, and I'm on the bottom and someone else is on the top. But what liberation calls for isn't sort of this inversion of this pyramid system, but rather dismantling of it altogether. So this idea that in acknowledging our power and privilege, the end game isn't sort of to give everything up so we have nothing, or so you have nothing and someone else has more, but rather to recognize that what liberation calls for is a world where we all have our needs met, where we all sort of have that access to watching that game without that fence there, where these systems of oppression aren't there, where they don't exist, and we sort of live in this world, where we all have that access to having our needs met. So this image here, similar but a little bit different. Um, what's different about this image than the last one? Anything that we can notice here that makes this picture different than the last one? Feel free to yell it out or write it in the chat. What's different about this one? Yeah, yeah, the hill slope of the fence, totally. So in the last image, we had folks of different heights. In this one, we see that it's, the people, that it's the ground that's uneven and the fence that's uneven. This is a way more accurate depiction of what, yeah, unequal starting point and larger obstacles. Yeah, the environment and the system, completely, yeah, spot on, everyone. So as opposed to sort of in this first image where we saw that people were different heights, this isn't totally accurate at all. This is a way more accurate depiction because, and many disability activists will speak to this as well, this idea that it's not that any individual human is born, the wrong way, or some people are born better, or some people are born taller, or more deserving of these things. We're all born deserving of having our needs met. However, this ground is uneven. We're born into these systems, where inherently folks, this environment, as Kelly's written here, where that ground is uneven, where that fence is uneven. So where the first image might suggest that the onus of this is on the individual person, that it's that this individual person was born, was born shorter or taller, and that's why they have better things. It's not that anyone is sort of born, in a way that makes them better than anyone else, but rather that we are born into this world where that ground, where these systems around us make it so that inherently there's that imbalance. So I have a friend who shared this with me, and it relates to this in that I have a friend who is autistic, and they were saying that they're like, my mom tells me that I'm not good at communicating, but when I'm in a room with other autistic people, I have no issue communicating at all. We communicate just fine with each other. We can communicate and get things done just fine. So the issue not being that on the individual person, but rather that we live in a world that prioritizes certain ways of communicating, certain ways of learning, certain ways of functioning as being the right way or the wrong way. But remembering that, yeah, this isn't sort of that there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way, but rather that this world that we're living in creates these barriers that privilege some and subjugate others. Okay, so next, how do we reprogram? So understanding, how what these effects looks like, and sort of the perspectives of it. How do we begin to reprogram? We're going to talk a little bit about unconscious bias. We have a whole two hour workshop on unconscious bias, so this is like a very small snippet of it. But essentially, we can think of unconscious bias as something that's cumulative. Um, Similar to sort of when we looked at the staircase, we don't just sort of get these biases out of nowhere, they accumulate. So heuristics is sort of the first part of this. We all have them. They are mental shortcuts that ease the cognitive load of decision making. Examples of our heuristics include using intuitive judgment or common sense. So, heuristics are what let us look at a word and know what the word says. Like you can look at the word bias and you know that it says bias without having to go like and like sound it out in your head. You can look at a word and know what it says. That is our heuristics at play. So if I wake up in the morning and I feel really tired, and I'm like, what am I going to do? What's going to help me? I feel so tired in the morning. Okay, I'm going to have a cup of coffee, and it works. And the next time I wake up and I'm tired, immediately I want coffee. I don't need to like and haw about like what I'm going to do because I'm tired. I wake up and I want coffee. Our heuristics, those shortcuts, sort of jump in to help us make decisions easier. And then we have our cognitive biases. So, a bias is an inclination or prejudice towards or against something or someone. Such cognitive shortcuts can result in prejudgments that can lead to rash decisions or discriminatory practices. So, from our heuristics, these mental shortcuts they can lead us to cognitive biases. These are sort of these cognitive shortcuts that lead to these prejudgments. So, say for example, I know in the morning I want my cup of coffee, and I go to the kitchen and my partner hands me a cup of tea, and I'm like, ew, this is gross. What is this? I need my coffee. I can't drink tea in the morning. I've developed this bias, right? Like this heuristic. I know it works for me. I know it doesn't work for me. Right away, I'm like, the only thing that I can have is coffee. I don't want anything else. We can develop from these mental shortcuts these biases where we favor something. We have a prejudice where we are inclined to something and don't want something else. We talked about a bit about stereotypes, but these biases can lead to stereotypes, that simplified assumption about entire group based on prior experiences. So maybe I then have a stereotype where every single other thing with caffeine in it is useless, and the only thing that is of value is my cup of coffee. From these shortcuts, we can get these biases and then these stereotypes where we just have this simplified assumption about a group of people, and this can lead to exclusion, the act of leaving someone out or creating barriers for certain groups, a form of discrimination typically based on these unconscious biases, so that these unconscious biases can then lead us to exclude entire groups of people when we're not aware sort of how our brains work in creating these shortcuts or these assumptions. So if unconscious biases go unchecked, can lead to a narrow pool of people that being hired and promoted. It can hinder creativity and diversity in a workplace, in a team situation, when we have people who are all really similar to one another, who are sort of the only people who are given power. It hinders our ability to be creative, to have diverse ideas. And this can stunt innovation, this can stunt growth, this can stunt productivity. When we only have a really narrow pool of people deciding factors and deciding things, we don't have a lot of space for the innovation of having different ideas and to grow and having different perspectives. There are over 50 different types of biases. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of them. Affinity bias is a really, really popular bias, common one. Affinity bias is what leads us to favor people who are like us. They remind me of myself, so they'll fit in here. I know that I've had this experience before. Maybe you have had too, where you meet someone new and you're like, wow, that person seemed great. I really clicked with that person. That person's awesome. And then I'll think about it a little bit more and I'm like, okay, well, that person had a really similar jacket on to a jacket that I have, and they mentioned that they like this TV show, and that's my favorite TV show. And it's like, okay, maybe that person's great, and maybe that was my affinity bias. We are drawn to, liking people who remind us of ourselves. And I don't think that there's anything inherently evil in feeling connected to people who we have things in common with. But when we are only, when we are actively only engaging with, sharing space with people who are like us, we're only welcoming people onto our teams who remind us of ourselves, if we're only sharing space with or working alongside people who, remind us of ourselves, we can get into really dangerous discriminatory territory. Confirmation bias it's what leads us to always search for or interpret information that confirms our preconceptions. So they turned up early, which must mean they'll be good with deadlines. So we're looking for one piece of information to confirm something we already want to be true. So just because someone turns up early doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be good with deadlines. Maybe they just, were able to catch the right bus today. That might not have anything to do with how they complete deadlines or complete work. The halo effect means we translate one good thing about a person to being able to succeed in many other areas. They are good at public speaking, so they will excel as a people leader. Just because someone's great at public speaking doesn't necessarily mean they'll be a great leader. And in fact, someone who's terrible at public speaking could be a great leader. Someone who's maybe more introverted might excel at connecting with people one-on-one on a more individual level and making people feel seen and heard in smaller interactions. Might be not great at public speaking, but could excel as a people leader. So we want to be aware of when we are attributing one positive quality to a bunch of different areas when those things might not necessarily relate. And the Kluvenhof effect means we generalize one negative trait to someone's whole personality, so the opposite of that halo effect. I don't like the way they dress, they must be unmotivated and unprofessional. So attributing that one negative quality to other areas. We've seen the Kluvenhof effect in effect if we think of the last sort of 2.5 years we've had with COVID-19 and the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes. We see a connection there between folks attributing this one thing. Okay, this virus started in this one area, and attributing that to an entire community of people. We've seen, as a result, a decrease in support for many Asian-owned businesses, an increase of Asian hate crimes. So again, just to recognize the real-life implications of when these biases aren't checked or challenged. So we're moving into our little story time aspect of our session today. Just a little bit on a lesson on intentions. So Sarah stepped on her colleague Lori's foot, and Lori exclaimed in pain. Sarah comforted Lori right away, saying, "Oh my goodness, are you okay? I am so sorry. I didn't mean to step on you. Can we get you some ice? Here, let me bring you a chair." Lori continued to wince in pain and nodded along with Sarah's suggestions. Sarah then went a step further and said, "Oh no, and that was your bad foot too, wasn't it?" Knowing that Lori had been on crutches in the weeks prior, having broken her foot. Lori nodded. Sarah acknowledged uh, that Sarah acknowledged that because of Lori's injury, she would have a lower pain tolerance than others in the room if someone else's foot had been stepped on. This can be paralleled with living at different intersections. Because society inflicts more harm on marginalized folks through things like microaggressions, it's likely they've experienced pain before the moment it was caused by you. This means that the pain would be amplified by prior experiences, like how Lori's pain was amplified by her prior injury. So the first acknowledgement here was one of pain, and the reaction was accepted as valid. Sarah didn't say, Lori, you know me, I'm a good person. I don't step on people's feet all the time. It was just a mistake. She didn't say, Lori, you're overreacting. I didn't step on you that hard. Her first acknowledgement was, the reaction, you've experienced pain, and that's a valid response. Sarah then went further, acknowledging that the pain might be amplified by Lori's previous experiences, and this dictated Sarah's response. So taking it a step further and recognizing, not only did I step on your foot and that hurts, but you have had your foot injured before. You were on crutches previously. This is going to be a lot worse than if I stepped on someone else's foot. So, by learning about the intricacies of anti oppression, we become more attuned in to the impacts of our actions and whether or not they were intentional. So, recognizing, even though we might not have meant to do something, we can recognize, that it's likely that through things like microaggressions, folks have experienced this harm before, which is going to make it a lot more painful. When we talk about being intentional, this is to narrow the risk of perpetuating exclusion. Our intentions do not absolve us of harm caused. So when we talk about, we want to be intentional, we want to work in intentional ways because that narrows the likelihood of us hurting someone. But that doesn't mean, that our intentions absolve us of the harm caused. We want to think about our intentions, we want to try our best, but that doesn't mean that when we cause someone harm that we don't want to focus on the impact. So I think it's really important for us to think about, not just what our intention was, but what the impact is. We could have had the best intention to not step on someone's foot, and the reality is, we've hurt someone. This is the impact. It's important to think of the impact of our actions, as opposed to just thinking about our intentions. If I had the best intentions and I was really, really prepared and I packed a first aid kit to go on a hike and my friend broke their leg, I wouldn't be like, oh, well, I brought a first aid kit, so we're good. I'm not going to take you to the hospital. I'd be like, okay, though I tried to be prepared, we need something more than what my intentions aren't going to help you here. The impact is that I need to bring you to the hospital. The tools that I brought weren't sufficient for the pain that's being experienced, and something else needs to be done. So I think it's really important to recognize that, and recognize, though it might not have been my intention to cause someone harm, the impact is that I did. Okay, story number 2. This time I'm going to go through and read a story out. And as I read it, I want you to think about what the microaggressions in this story are and what could be done differently. Cleo was attending a conference on diversity and inclusion. She had signed up for each workshop before the event to make sure she secured her spot before they ran out. In the morning, she attended a workshop on inclusive communications, which she was passionate about because she worked in communications at an engineering firm. She'd been struggling to find ways to integrate more inclusion in her work, so this session felt really meaningful. Halfway throughout the session, Cleo had to use the washroom. She exited the room and scanned the hallway for one. She wandered along and couldn't find any until she finally turned a corner and spotted them. Neither of the gendered washrooms had wheelchair accessible stalls, so Cleo turned around and headed for the elevators. She tried the ground floor and scanned around again. Finally, she was able to find an accessible washroom. Afterwards, she made her way back to the workshop only to find that it was nearly over and she had missed the part discussing practical skills. Cleo headed into lunch, comforted by the fact that the Intersectionality 101 workshop she had signed up for was scheduled soon. She made her way to the boardroom, only to find that there were 2 steps leading up to it and a very narrow doorway. She had attended the conference alone and didn't feel comfortable asking strangers to lift her in her chair and help her squeeze through the doorway. She decided to attend the workshop on disability justice instead, which was on the ground floor with no steps. Cleo found an event organizer and let them know of her disappointment. They replied, I'm so sorry to hear that. That really sucks. So, what do we see as microaggressions in this story, and what do we think could be done differently? You can unmute or write in the chat. Yeah, event organizers not thinking about accessible washrooms for attendees. Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, that the space was inaccessible. Absolutely. Yeah, I think in an ideal world, you know, we would this conference would have been held in a space that was accessible, and I also think that the reality of the world that we live in is that a lot of spaces are created inaccessibly, and so then I think that the responsibility is then to at the very least share that accessibility information in advance. Maybe this was the only venue that was within the organization's budget, that they could afford, or that was in the area that was accessible. If that was the case, then that accessibility information, it's important that that is shared in advance. So whether that be on the event page or sent out to folks, or to ask people's accessibility needs in advance, so that Cleo could show up to that event and know at least in advance where those washrooms were, or that maybe she wanted to bring someone who could help her up the steps that she felt comfortable with. Yeah, apologize. Say that we'll do better next time and offer to send her a copy of the outline notes for the conference she missed. Absolutely. That response. I feel like multiple people are touching on this here. Yeah, there's not a lot of accountability in just saying, I'm sorry to hear that that really sucks. Doesn't really do anything. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, seems inadequate and doesn't signal any intent to improve things. Organizer didn't reply with an action response, was placating. Absolutely. Replying to that really sucks. Ends the conversation. You're all saying what I'm going to say. You're all saying it in the comments here. Yeah. There could be more information available in the event agenda about accessibility, so that Cleo could have at least been aware of the challenges beforehand. Absolutely. Yeah, event organizer not recognizing their role in the inaccessibility. Totally. There's no accountability there. Just saying that really sucks doesn't do anything to say what's going to happen, that it won't happen again, or, any action response. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. You're all 10 out of 10. The organizer, even I think some people just, I think it's not easy for everyone to know exactly what to say in the moment. Maybe that's, the event organizer had a lot going on. In that case, I think it's totally okay to say, I'm very sorry. Can I get your email or your phone number or your contact information and follow up with you? And then take that time and think and reflect on that, and then follow up and say, I want to offer you a recording or a refund, or this is what we're going to do differently in the future. We're going to have it at this venue, and I'd love to give you tickets. Here are the notes from the session you missed. There are, ideally that could all be held in that moment. And also, we are human, and we can't always say everything perfectly in the moment, in which case I think to take that space and reflect is super important to do. Yes, Rosie, absolutely. Great catch with that one. Having a disability justice workshop when not having an accessible space is performative. Absolutely. Also, the fact that the disability justice workshop is the one that's on the ground floor, there's an assumption there, like, okay, well, this one's on the ground floor. That's the one that people with disabilities will want to attend. There's a microaggression there, this assumption, without recognizing that Cleo wants to go to a communications workshop, and that people with disabilities will have a diverse range of topics that they're interested in. Planning team have a diverse groups of planners. Yeah, the challenges might have been caught beforehand. Yes, great point, Carly. Talking about that last one, um, when I was talking about unconscious biases, when we don't have those people in the room, we're more likely to have issues like this come up. Great work, everyone. Okay, full transparency. I'm running behind time, so I want to say now that if you have to leave right at 8:30, that is fair, and I understand, and I'm sorry that I'm not running on time, and that you have a recording. So I'm just giving you a 7-minute heads up that I'm going to go like 5 minutes over. I'm sorry. I respect your time and your evenings, and I want you to go and relax on. But I don't want to rush, because then it's hard to follow along. So if you have to leave at 8:30, thank you for being here. Okay, we're on the last step, though, I promise. Next, okay, what can we do? So we have all this information. What do we do with it? Frequency bias. This is a bias I have not mentioned yet. It occurs when you notice something new and all of a sudden you see it everywhere. Last year, my partner and I, our car got stolen, and we got it back. No worries. It was found like a couple weeks later. That's not the point of my story. The point of my story is that we got a rental car in the meantime. It was a red Kia Soul. And when we were driving it around, I was like, I've never noticed how many people have these cars before. Like, I've never noticed all these like little boxy cars driving around on the road, and now I'm seeing them everywhere. That is what frequency bias is. When we, notice something new and then all of a sudden you notice it everywhere. Like if you get a new pair of glasses and you're like, everyone has the same glasses as me. That's frequency bias. What our aim is with anti-oppression training is to help produce an intentional frequency bias. We want to build that up on purpose. So you can be out moving throughout the world and be like, that was a microaggression. This space is inaccessible. That was upholding a system of oppression, and that was acting on unconscious biases. What we want to do is create this intentional frequency bias where the more that you surround yourself with this type of work and using this anti-oppressive lens, the easier it becomes to notice and name the things when they show up around us. Folks often want to know what they can do. I think that's one of the biggest questions that we're often asked at these workshops is like, okay, but will we know what we can do to, change things or stop things? I want to ask, why might the collective instinct to do be harmful? Any thoughts on that? Why might that collective instinct to do, you know, why might that be harmful? Any thoughts on that? Feel free to say it out loud or in the chat. Why might our collective instinct to do? Yes, totally. Thanks, Catherine, for jumping in there. It can prevent leaving space to listen and learn. Spot on. I think that when we think about doing, we often can discount how important it is to do that work internally first. And to also, we can discredit how important like listening and learning is as doing, that these are really important aspects of doing is first listening and learning. When we just sort of want to get out there and do something, it's the what we can. Yeah, totally. Sometimes making space is the most important action. Yeah, when we sort of jump into the space of doing, we can end up centering ourselves or what we think is right or speaking over other people. I think it's important to remember that folks within these communities often know what it is that they need, that they are the best experts in their experience, and instead of assuming that we can jump in and do something that hasn't been thought of, that we can instead listen and reflect and start doing that internal work first of, okay, what how might I be using my privilege and power in a way that is causing harm to others? Doing that work first, and instead of centering our own belief that we can support, or we had in when we were doing the exercise where we wrote down the impacts, that saviorism complex. Yeah, what can I do as a selfish way of going about it? Totally. Instead of asking, instead of sort of listening and learning and reflecting, disempowering, yeah, and patronizing that we know better. Spot on, exactly. This idea that we, must have an answer, know something, instead of recognizing, okay, how instead might I listen or just amplify the voices of people who've been doing this work a lot longer or might be experts and who are better experts in their own experience. Yeah, it might result in people who experience the harm being bombarded with well intentioned questions, comments, and requests for labor. Absolutely. Yes, we want to be aware of sort of the emotional burden, of the emotional labor that comes with, asking someone questions, or, instead of just listening and following the lead of others. When we do that work, when we center, inadvertently center ourselves in our own discomfort. Yeah, absolutely. So, anti oppression is a responsible and ethical use of our privilege and power. It involves us thinking about how we can use the power and privilege that we live with in ethical and responsible ways. This requires grappling with our own privilege and understanding how this can impact our blank spots. Um, we spoke about this idea that when we have privilege in a certain area, it can impact sort of what we see and what we don't see. Um, Another sort of double point to this note is recognizing where we can use more inclusive language. So using blank spots and avoiding, using words like blind spots and ableist language. Often that this is just sort of an additional side to the language in this point of euphemisms around blindness that are rooted in ableism. So things like the blind leading the blind or having a blind spot. That ways that we sort of colloquially in language can use blindness as a sort of like a metaphor for not knowing something or an unawareness. So there's just a little offer around language in that one as well, of wanting to do an inventory around where our blank spots are. Recognizing harm caused by privileged people, including ourselves now and historically. None of us are individually responsible for the actions of our ancestors, and yet it is so important for us to understand privilege, and how it exists historically, and what the actions of those before us has afforded us or are not afforded us today. I think it's important to do that inventory and recognize that harm that has been caused now and historically. Taking a step back and reflecting before acting. Reactiveness carries a greater risk of unconscious bias, and it takes time to untangle this. When we are reactive, we're more likely to act on those unconscious biases, which is why in that previous slide I said, if you don't think we're going to say the right thing, it's okay to say, hey, can I follow up with you, or can I get back to you on this? I think when we're trying to act really fast, and we also live in a really fast paced world that tells us we need to do things right away, and I think that can often cause more harm when we're being reactive. So I encourage also that to be able to take that step back and reflect. Listening, following leadership from marginalized groups, restructuring how we distribute our resources. Talked about that in our equity slide. So thinking, how can we distribute resources in a way that is more equitable? Proactive structures that protect folks involved and provide them accessible avenues to voice feedback, grievances, and desires for change. Remembering that not everyone's going to feel comfortable expressing discomfort. So I think it's important to have more than one person that you can, turn to give feedback to, instead of maybe just having one person in charge. Maybe you have a couple people that you can report to. Another thing that we do at Backhow that I find is really nice is having like anonymous feedback forms where we can give that feedback. Again, recognizing that not everyone's going to feel comfortable voicing their discomfort or their grievances or desires for change. And an equitable lens that picks up on the intricacies of injustice and imagines inclusive alternatives. So again, that we're developing that lens that will support us in looking at these nuances, and imagining more inclusive options. This is the last slide, everyone. So anti-oppression in action, it takes momentum. Remembering that we don't want to burn out in this work. Said this in the start, but there's not a clear beginning, middle, and end, meaning that this is ongoing work. So how do we sustain momentum so that we continue thinking about these things beyond just a 2-hour session, but to instead continue that momentum and that upkeep beyond this, to make sure that we're continuing to listen and learn and develop these skills and think about what it looks like to create more equitable spaces. Curiosity, getting curious. So why do we do things the way that we do? Why do we think this way? Is this the best way to do something? Why is that the person that I feel closest to or closest with? To continue to be curious. Why we think things, the things we think, why we do things is really important. Critical thinking, developing that critical thinking lens, using those tools like intersectionality to sort of look at the nuances of this work, recognizing that sometimes it's really overt and sometimes it's really implicit. How do we continue to use that critical thinking lens to unpack the way that oppression impacts the people around us and ourselves? And finally, gratitude. I think that when someone sort of brings to our attention a moment of harm that we've caused, or something we can do better, it's really easy to go into that feelings of guilt and shame. I know I lead this workshop all of the time, and even still, when someone's like, hey, I didn't like that, it's really hard to not be like, oh no, I'm a bad person, I didn't mean to. It's so human, and it's also so important to remember that part of being human means that we will experience harm and also cause harm, and that to instead try to reshift our thinking around it. So something that I've tried to do to sort of ease that discomfort is to think like, I'm so grateful that someone trusts me enough to bring this to my attention, and I'm so grateful that like gratitude that someone's providing me with something that will allow me to show up better for the people in the world and in my life, and to build better relationships. I think that it can be really important to think about how important it is that we get comfortable having uncomfortable conversations with one another, and to thinking about things that might be uncomfortable, because ultimately, I think that when we have these conversations, it means that we believe in one another enough to want the same things from our communities, and that that's something ultimately to be grateful for. And I want to end by expressing my gratitude for all of you. Thank you for sticking with me to the bitter end. 3 minutes over, not that bad. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure presenting to all of you today. I will send over the slides if you want to look at them. You also get this recording. Thanks for bearing with me through the rescheduling of dates as well. I know it's hard to stare at your computer screen this late into the evening. Go have a good night. Thanks so much, everyone. You can follow us at Backhow Consulting on Instagram. You can also email me if you want. Yeah, you're welcome, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so much,
you.
Shanique. That was so
That
wonderful.
was great.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You're all great. Have a good night. Take
You
care, everyone.
too.